No synthetic material has received so much airtime as plastic. In the 1950s, it was all good news. Plastic ushered in a new throwaway culture, which would save, especially housewives, time and effort, for example, on washing up. However, the message has changed dramatically, and now we see the impact of our exploitative extraction and production, hyperconsumption and wasteful practices everywhere we turn. A Google search of plastic pollution will bring up thousands of stories of the myriad ways we throw our plastic items too. If we can bring ourselves to look closely enough, we start to realise that the source of plastic waste often ends up thousands of kilometres away from the source of responsibility. The production of plastic has grown exponentially since it was first mass-produced in the 1950s. One estimate is that 8.3 billion metric tonnes of virgin plastics have been produced since then. And to get a sense of what that 8.3 billion looks like, you could imagine the weight of 25,000 Empire State Buildings or a billion elephants. And if you spread all that plastic out ankle deep, it would cover an area the size of Argentina, the 8th largest country in the world. According to ecological footprint experts, the planet can sustain global demand at about 1.8 global hectares per person. New Zealand's current footprint is estimated at about 4 times that, at 4.31 global hectares per person. So Kiwis are consuming way too much and living beyond our means. If we want to see future generations living well on our planet, we're going to have to do something drastic about reducing this figure. In 2009, a group of scientists developed the 9 planetary boundaries paradigm. The idea is that if you transgressed any of these boundaries, a serious planetary crisis would be triggered. The green areas represent human activities that are within safe margins. The yellow areas represent human activities that may or may not have exceeded safe margins, and the red areas represent human activities that have exceeded safe margins. So you can see there are 3 categories with question marks here, and one of them is novel entities. Safe margins have not yet been identified for these. Because of the complex chemicals used in plastic production and the toxins that get involved with plastics once they are in the natural environment, one of those novel entities is plastic pollution. Like anthropogenic climate change and radionuclides from the use of nuclear weapons, our production of huge amounts of non-biodegradable materials are also beginning to appear as geological markers. One of these materials is plastic. The picture you see here is a plastaglomerate. Plastaglomerate is a recently coined term to describe a stone that contains mixtures of sedimentary grains and other natural debris, like shells and wood, held together by hardened, molten plastic. Essentially, we're now starting to find plastics in geological formations. Some of the 8.3 billion metric tonnes of plastics that have been produced since the 1950s are still in use, but the vast majority have been since thrown away as they have broken down. But to where? Where is this magical away place? Well, around 80% of the plastics ever produced ends up in the natural environment and landfills. It's been estimated that if present trends continue, by 2050, there will be 12 billion metric tonnes of plastic going to landfills. But landfills are far from ideal ways for plastic too. We need to think of these merely as temporary storage facilities. Plastics will only be held in landfills for a while because 100% of even the most sophisticated landfills fail 80 years after they are built. When this happens, plastics and toxic leachate from the flame retardants and plasticizers and colorants used in plastic production will eventually contaminate soil and water. So all plastics ever made will end up in the natural environment eventually. And the final destination are oceans, the final sink. What about recycling, you say? Well, recycling on a global scale, well, we've only recycled 9% of all the plastics we've ever produced. 9%. And the plastics industry is set to increase production by 33 to 36% in just the next 5 years. This huge increase in plastic production will even further undermine our current efforts to manage the stuff by recycling it. The scale of plastic production cannot ever be met by recycling. Recycling has always lagged behind global production, and the lag is going to exponentially increase between now and 2025. But it gets worse. China no longer accepts our plastics, and a growing number of developing countries are following suit. So that 9% global recycling rate is also set to further plummet due to shrinking markets for post-consumer plastics. Some of this is in response to what we now understand as waste colonialism or toxic colonialism. And these terms have been applied where waste from more developed countries is shipped off to less developed countries, where they don't have the capacity to safely and ethically recycle these hazardous items. The ban amendment to the Basel Convention would mean banning the export of plastic waste contaminated with hazardous chemicals from more developed countries to less developed countries. Currently, 66 countries have ratified the amendment. Only 2 more countries need to ratify the ban amendment for it to be part of the Basel Convention. Aotearoa is one country identified as not having ratified the amendment. Aotearoa has also made the headlines, not in a good way, recently for sending plastic waste to Malaysia, where they're burning and dumping the waste they can't process. Like China, Malaysia has since also shut its borders down to imports of other countries' hazardous plastic waste. China's ban left New Zealand with 400 tonnes of stockpiled waste at our ports. Malaysia's recent shutdown will dramatically increase that number. Recycling is also a dirty business and has a tendency to introduce new toxic additives into the waste stream. Children's toys and other products made from recycled plastics have recently been found to be contaminated with flame retardants. So we need another solution, something that is not reliant on recycling. Okay then, what about burning plastic waste to generate energy? Think again. Incineration is expensive and takes around 25 years for investors to break even. They lock countries into a perpetual cycle of producing and importing waste to feed the beast, the opposite of a zero waste approach. And incineration leaves a legacy of contaminated air, soil and water. There is currently a proposal for an incineration plant in Huntly, and some Pacific Island nations are also seriously entertaining the idea of establishing an incineration plant to deal with the plastic pollution crisis. But this is a really bad idea. Producing lower grade plastic materials from plastic waste, known as downcycling, is not the solution either. Plastics have been downcycled into roading, fence posts, park benches out of plastic waste. And just remember, no matter where we put it, no matter our choice of holding pattern, plastic never goes away. It just ends up in some other form with a greater potential for harm. Plastic waste ends up thousands of kilometres away from the extraction of fossil fuels and petrochemicals used to produce plastics and their toxic additives. This is Henderson Island. It is uninhabited, and yet it has the dubious honour of holding the title as one of the most polluted places on Earth. So how does plastic move so far? Its lightweight, durable and mobile properties means it travels pretty well in tidal flows, freshwater ecosystems and air. It also moves around in global trade flows. As plastics break down in air, light, heat and wave action, they become heavier and more porous. This increases their surface area and makes them more capable of carrying pathogens, invasive species and persistent organic pollutants around. They can also become heavier and sink to the sea floor. Scientists are finding a disturbing volume of microplastics on the ocean floor of the last of the Earth's frontiers, including the 10-kilometre deep Marianas Trench. They've also been found in Arctic ice and in the Antarctic. Plastic pollution is truly a global challenge and a matter of common concern to all humankind. Plastic flows across territorial and maritime boundaries, escapes waste management systems, including landfill and incineration plants, and even ends up across cell membranes. The safe disposal and circular management of plastics that contain toxic additives is simply not possible. Plastics literally never go away, they just end up in some other smaller and more hazardous form somewhere else. For example, when they break down in the marine environment, they attract additional pollutants in the form of industrial chemicals and pesticides or POPs. Plastics leach toxic additives and those additional POPs into the bodies of marine birds, fish and mammals when they're mistaken for food. When microplastics break down even further into nanoparticles, they are small enough to pass through cell walls, including gut, brain, and testes. This means we need to think carefully about how unnecessary and avoidable production and consumption choices are ultimately contaminating our food chain and impacting human, non-human, and environmental health. As can be seen in this diagram, there's a direct correlation between plastic production and climate change. The latest estimates are that we use 4% of the world's share of oil consumption to produce plastic polymers, and then an additional 4% of oil in the manufacture of plastic products. In 2050, 15% of the global share of the carbon budget will be allocated to plastics production, unless we do something radical about it now. Plastics have also recently been found to emit methane and therefore to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions as they break down. So then, what is the solution? Does it make sense to keep bailing out the bath while the tap keeps running? Well, this is what nations have been doing for decades. It's clearly not working, and it is time to turn off the tap. We have reached a crisis point, and to effectively respond, we need a multilateral and multi-scale approach. With enough support from member states, hope is possible in the form of a new international plastic pollution treaty. The United Nations Environmental Assembly, or UNEA, is the parliament of the environment. UNEA has recognised plastic pollution as a rapidly increasing, serious issue of global concern that needs an urgent global response. In 2018, UNEA formed an expert group. Many members of this expert group proposed an international treaty as the most effective response. The proposed treaty captures the full life cycle of plastics, from production to plastics lost to the environment, and focuses on the top of the waste hierarchy, prevention. These top-of-pipe solutions, or turning off the tap solutions, could include restricting the volume of new or virgin plastics allowed to be used in new products, banning avoidable plastic products and polymers, regulating toxic additives and clearly identifying the additives used in eco-labelling. The treaty is also designed to ensure that developed countries provide capacity and financial support to less developed countries in meeting plastic pollution reduction targets. Pacific Island representatives in other developing nations are at the coalface of the plastic pollution crisis. So it's no surprise that many made statements of early support for a legally binding international plastic pollution treaty at a UN expert group meeting in Geneva last year. So did more than 90 civil society organisations and a growing number of other United Nations member states. Australia and New Zealand haven't yet. Plastic pollution travels around the globe through trade, on winds, river and tidal flows, and the guts of migrating birds and mammals. Because of its transboundary movement, plastic pollution cannot be solved solely within national borders or through regional agreements. This makes plastic pollution a matter of international concern. A global, legally binding treaty with clear targets and standards is a real game changer we urgently need. And the treaty must be legally binding, since voluntary commitments can mask vested interests in the fossil fuel industry. In March 2019, countries meet again at UNEA 4 in Nairobi with a chance to start making plastic pollution history. Let's hope there is enough support from member states, including New Zealand and Australia, to make that happen.